When I first moved into Maplewood Estates, I thought I had finally found peace. After years of living in cramped apartments and noisy neighborhoods, the rows of manicured lawns and calm cul-de-sacs felt like a dream. My house sat at the corner of Birch Lane, with a white fence I built myself and a garden that smelled of fresh lavender. For the first few months, life was perfect. Neighbors waved, kids played outside, and the HOA seemed like nothing more than a friendly organization that kept things tidy. But peace has a way of drawing envy, and mine came in the form of the HOA president, Mrs. Ellen Cranston, a woman who wore her power like a crown. She was the type of person who smiled while ruining your day. It started small. A letter in my mailbox one morning said my trash bins were visible from the street for too long. Then, a $50 fine for grass height violation. I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just strict about the rules. But the letters kept coming. Each week, a new accusation. My mailbox was apparently 2 inches taller than the HOA regulation. My garden gnome was considered aesthetic disruption. I laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake until I saw Ellen's car parked across from my house every few days. Her phone out, taking pictures. The pattern was too deliberate to ignore. It felt personal. I tried to be polite, to play by the book, but no matter how many times I fixed something, another complaint followed. The neighbors started avoiding me, afraid that being friendly with me might make them her next target. My mailbox became a symbol of defiance in her perfect little kingdom, and I began to feel trapped in my own home. The HOA fines piled up hundreds, then thousands of dollars for reasons that barely made sense. Each letter was signed by Ellen herself, her perfect cursive mocking me. One night I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by those papers, realizing I wasn't the only one. I found an online forum for Maplewood residents, buried in a community page, where several people complained about the same woman, how she had bullied families into selling their homes, reported minor infractions that forced people to pay outrageous fees, and used her position to silence anyone who questioned her authority. It wasn't just control, it was obsession. And it hit me, the HOA wasn't her job. It was her empire. Every home sale, every fine, every broken resident fed her ego and padded her bank account. She ran the neighborhood like a dictator, hiding behind the bylaws. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Ellen control my life anymore. I started documenting everything, every letter, every photo she took, every conversation with neighbors too scared to speak up. I went through the HOA's public financial reports, and what I found was strange. There were missing entries, large maintenance payments that didn't line up with any visible projects. Thousands of dollars listed under vague categories like beautification and infrastructure improvements, and the same contractors kept popping up, small companies owned by names that didn't show up anywhere else online. Something was off, and Ellen was at the center of it. I knew I couldn't take her down alone, but I also knew fear kept everyone else quiet. I needed to find a way to make the neighborhood see the truth without putting them directly in danger. For weeks, I watched and waited, pretending to comply, keeping my lawn perfect and my bins hidden. I even waved at Ellen when she passed by, pretending everything was fine. But behind that fake smile, I was building something far bigger than she could imagine. The HOA wanted control, but I wanted ownership. And soon, I would have both. Because if Ellen thought she could destroy my peace, she was about to learn what happens when you push the wrong man too far. And as the first frost of winter settled over Maplewood, I began setting the plan in motion, quietly, patiently, one step at a time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Winter settled heavily over Maplewood Estates, coating the perfectly trimmed lawns and white picket fences in a thin layer of frost. The neighborhood looked calm on the outside, but I had begun to see it for what it truly was, a stage where Ellen played queen and everyone else played along out of fear. While most residents were busy decorating for the holidays, I spent my nights digging deeper into the HOA's hidden world. Every fine I received, every notice, every signature from Ellen became a piece of a puzzle I was slowly putting together. I requested public HOA records under state transparency laws, posing as a curious homeowner. What came back confirmed my suspicions. Ellen wasn't just issuing bogus fines. She was funneling HOA funds into a company registered under her cousin's name, a shell business that handled landscaping and repairs. But the more I found, the more dangerous it became. Ellen had eyes everywhere. She somehow knew which homeowners were unhappy, who had whispered complaints, and who had dared to question her authority. Those people suddenly found themselves drowning in fines, their reputations smeared at community meetings, their homes mysteriously vandalized overnight. Fear had silenced everyone, but I was past that point. I knew I couldn't confront her directly. She'd spin it around, make me the villain like she'd done to others. No, I needed to outsmart her, to make her crumble under the same system she created. So I played along, paying small fines to stay under her radar, pretending to be just another submissive resident. Meanwhile, I began buying information, discreetly contacting old board members who had resigned, local contractors who once worked with the HOA, even a former treasurer who'd mysteriously moved away after a dispute. Their stories painted the same picture. Ellen manipulated budgets, pushed residents to sell when they couldn't afford fines, and then quietly profited through backdoor real estate deals. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was milking it dry. My quiet evenings turned into long nights filled with spreadsheets, property records, and ownership documents. I began noticing a pattern. Every time a house went into foreclosure due to HOA fines, it was bought by the same investment firm one Ellen's husband conveniently worked for. That's when I realized her game wasn't just power. It was money, too. She had turned Maplewood into a business empire built on control, fear, and greed. I started forming a plan, not just to expose her, but to take everything she valued. My research led me to the HOA bylaws, those thick, boring pages most people never read. Hidden deep inside was a clause that allowed any homeowner, with enough backing, to call for a vote of no confidence to replace the board, but only if they owned a minimum of 51% of the total community property shares. It was a nearly impossible threshold, something Ellen likely never thought anyone could reach. But impossible wasn't the same as unachievable. The key was property shares, and each home represented one. If I could find a way to buy up homes under different names, using investment fronts or willing sellers desperate to leave, I could shift the balance of ownership. Ellen had built her kingdom on manipulation. I was going to buy it out from under her. The first step was quiet. I reached out to those who had been wronged. Families crushed by fines, retirees bullied into submission, young couples whose dream homes had turned into nightmares. Some were angry, others broken, but they all had one thing in common: they wanted out. I offered to buy their homes for fair prices through different LLCs I set up quietly. I used savings, took loans, and even found a few silent investors who hated HOAs as much as I did. By spring, I had purchased 4 homes and was negotiating 2 more. It was slow, risky, and expensive, but it was working. Meanwhile, Ellen began to grow suspicious. Her tone shifted from smug to cold in her letters, and I noticed her car parked outside more often. She could sense something was changing, but she couldn't see what. I made sure of that. At HOA meetings, I sat quietly in the back, pretending disinterest, letting her believe she was still in control. All the while, I was stacking dominoes behind the curtain. I wasn't just gathering property, I was gathering evidence, allies, and momentum. Every signature, every transaction, every payment trail was recorded and stored. Ellen's empire was built on secrecy. Mine was built on proof. And soon, one truth would topple the other. By the time the snow began to melt, Maplewood's perfect little image had started to crack. More homeowners whispered behind closed doors. Rumors of embezzlement spread quietly, and neighbors who once ignored me began to nod again when I walked by. The tide was turning. Ellen didn't know it yet, but the neighborhood she ruled with fear was slowly slipping through her fingers, and I was the one pulling the strings. The war had begun, and for the first time I wasn't just defending my home, I was taking back the entire neighborhood. By the time spring turned to summer, Maplewood Estates no longer felt like the peaceful community I had once admired. Behind every freshly cut hedge and every friendly smile, tension was brewing. The whispers had grown louder, and Ellen could sense it. Her once flawless control over the HOA was beginning to crack, though she didn't yet know how deep the rot went. I had successfully acquired 6 properties through separate LLCs, all disguised under different ownership names. Each purchase was quiet, strategically placed, and carefully timed, so it didn't trigger suspicion from the HOA board. On paper, these homes belonged to independent buyers, but in truth, they were mine. Silent pawns in a game Ellen didn't even know she was playing. The beauty of Maplewood's system was its rigidity. Every rule that had once been used against homeowners could now be turned into a weapon against its creator. I began to notice a change in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Fewer people showed up at the HOA meetings, and those who did came with folded arms and silent resentment. Ellen, however, doubled down. She started issuing more fines, targeting anyone who questioned her. Fresh coats of paint on fences were suddenly non-compliant shades. New mailboxes, unauthorized replacements, and garden ornaments, violations of community aesthetic. It was her way of reasserting control, but it only made people angrier. I didn't need to convince them Ellen was corrupt anymore. She was doing that herself. I just needed to wait for the right moment to expose her. I began spending my evenings sitting on my porch, watching her drive by slowly, her silver SUV creeping past every few days. She was looking for mistakes, for something to use against me, but my property was flawless. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every light fixture, all perfectly within regulation. It infuriated her. The more perfect I became, the more desperate she grew. Around that time, I received a notice from the HOA claiming I had failed to submit a garden modification request for my flower beds. Even though I hadn't changed anything, it was a test, a way for her to provoke me, to make me slip up. But instead of reacting, I simply documented it, saved it, and filed a quiet complaint with the state's Homeowners Commission, attaching copies of her false claims. It was the first official crack in her armor. At the same time, I kept growing my hold on the neighborhood. A retired couple, the Lewises, finally gave up after Ellen fined them for their bird bath. They sold their house to one of my LLCs and left town quietly. A young family next door moved too, worn down by years of harassment over their children's toys being visible from the street. Another property acquired, another share of the HOA gained. Piece by piece, I was dismantling Ellen's empire. But even the smartest plans face risks, and mine came in the form of an anonymous letter left in my mailbox one morning. It wasn't an HOA notice, it was a warning. The letter said, "She knows you're up to something. Be careful who you trust. No signature, no return address." Just those words. I scanned the neighborhood, wondering who had written it. Was it a neighbor, a sympathizer, or someone still loyal to Ellen? I didn't know. But it confirmed something important. She was suspicious, and she was watching more closely than ever. So I adapted. I slowed my property acquisitions and shifted focus toward the real target, the HOA's internal structure. The bylaws stated that any homeowner who owned more than 5% of the community's total property could request access to detailed board meeting minutes and financial ledgers. I had just crossed that threshold. When I made the request, Ellen tried to block it, claiming there were privacy concerns. But the law wasn't on her side anymore. The commission I had contacted earlier intervened, forcing her to comply. What I received was gold. Buried within those ledgers were dozens of payments to companies that didn't exist. Phantom vendors with vague descriptions like landscape improvement and community enhancement. Thousands of dollars gone, with Elon's signature on nearly every approval. I had proof of embezzlement. Real, undeniable proof. I could have gone public right then, but I didn't, not yet. Timing was everything. I wanted to make sure that when Ellen fell, she wouldn't just lose her title, she'd lose everything. I started to quietly leak hints to the community. Anonymous letters slipped into mailboxes, printed copies of suspicious financial pages taped to notice boards, rumors whispered during yard sales and block parties. Within weeks, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were angry, confused, and scared. Ellen responded the only way she knew how, with control. She called an emergency HOA meeting, furious and defensive, accusing troublemakers of spreading lies. At this time, fewer people clapped when she spoke. I could feel it, the tide had turned. My plan was working. Ellen had built her power through fear and intimidation, but I had built mine through patience and truth. And soon, both would collide in the most public way possible, as the sun set. Over Maplewood that evening, I looked around at the quiet street that had once symbolized peace but had become a battlefield. My pieces were in place, my evidence was secure, and Ellen Cranston had no idea that the walls of her empire were already closing in. The next move would decide everything, and I was ready to strike. The emergency meeting Ellen called felt like the last stand of a ruler who knew her kingdom was slipping. The community center smelled of stale coffee and nervous breath. Folding chairs sat in rows as neighbors filed in with faces that were no longer smiling. Ellen stood at the podium with the poise of someone who had convinced herself she was untouchable. But the air was different this time, thinner, sharper, full of questions that could no longer be brushed away with a smile. I sat toward the back, blending into the crowd, my heart steady, though the room buzzed with tension. People were no longer afraid to look at each other. Suspicion had hardened into something like resolve. Ellen spoke about community standards and responsibility. It's about unity and maintaining home values, but her words were met with awkward silence. Someone dared to mention the missing funds, and she deflected with practiced ease, blaming accounting errors and promising audits. That was her playbook. Deflect, apologize, promise reform, and watch the storm pass. But she had miscalculated the depth of the hole she had dug. The audit she promised was the exact opening I needed. I volunteered, in a quiet, unassuming way, to help organize the audit request. The bylaws required a specific procedure and a minimum number of signatures to force an independent audit. I had quietly secured those signatures over the past months from owners who no longer trusted Ellen. The motion passed by a narrow margin. And for the first time, a neutral accountant was allowed to comb through 3 years of HOA finances. The audit did not disappoint. It revealed a pattern of irregular invoices, duplicate payments, inflated contractor fees, and shell companies that led back to Ellen and several of her close associates. The more the accountant dug, the more the paper trail swelled into something undeniable. At the same time, I kept buying strategically, but more importantly, I kept listening. People who had long ago packed their bags and left the neighborhood, victims of Ellen's quiet campaigns, began to call me. Some wanted their stories told. Others wanted compensation. I recorded everything, every testimony stitched to the financial evidence, building a narrative that would be impossible to dismiss as petty neighborhood squabbling. But the deeper the audit went, the nastier Ellen got. She began to lash out in ways that were both petty and dangerous. She weaponized procedural technicalities to freeze community projects, withheld approvals so that repair work stalled, and even tried to enlist local law enforcement by filing restraining orders and absurd complaints against those who spoke against her. She painted herself as a martyr, and some still believed her desperate script. The real danger, however, was not in her words. It was in what she would do next if cornered. In the quiet hours between daylight and midnight, I found an unexpected ally, the former treasurer I had tracked down months earlier. A man who had fled town when Elon's power circle tightened. He came back under the cover of secrecy, bringing with him torn checkbooks and bank statements that had been hidden when he resigned. He told me about late-night meetings, about blank endorsement lines on checks, and about a pattern where properties were bullied into foreclosure and then quietly resold to a company connected to Elon's husband. That revelation was the missing piece that connected her petty finds to a larger, greed-driven scheme. But there was another darker thread I hadn't anticipated. While going through a box of documents the treasurer left behind, I found a set of deeds and signatures that didn't match the names listed. Several signatures appeared to be forgeries. Signatures that had been used to transfer small parcels and easements without the true owner's informed consent. One in particular stood out, the deed to a tiny strip of communal green that had, on paper, been transferred to an LLC controlled by Ellen's cousin. In reality, the green space had been used by the community for decades. a place where children's bikes were left and holiday lights hung. The forgery suggested a level of calculated deceit that crossed a line. It was no longer just greed, it was theft by manipulation. I took the documents to a reputable handwriting expert and, as we suspected, the signatures did not match the homeowner's known marks. This was beyond HOA politics. This was fraud. With fraud on the table, the stakes changed. I began to assemble a case not just for the HOA, but for the authorities. I quietly contacted a lawyer experienced in nonprofit and homeowners association law, someone who understood how these communities could be twisted for personal gain. The lawyer advised caution, but confirmed that the evidence, financial irregularities, shell companies, forged deeds, could form the basis of a criminal referral if presented correctly. Meanwhile, Elon's behavior escalated into intimidation. She began to target families who had signed petitions for the audit, leaving threatening notes and making veiled remarks about property values and community standing. One afternoon, a neighbor's mailbox was vandalized, and someone spray-painted an obscene message on a shed belonging to a homeowner who had been vocal at the meetings. It was a clear signal: push back and you pay. Fear still worked, but now it worked both ways. Ellen used fear to try and silence dissent, while I used truth to gather courage. I organized discreet meetings with residents who had been most affected by her policies, those who had been humiliated into silence, and I offered them an option the community rarely considered: collective ownership. If we could buy back the properties and the small commercial lots Ellen had quietly acquired through her network, we could reverse her financial grip on Maplewood. It was ambitious and expensive, but the idea struck a chord in a neighborhood that had been stripped of agency. Donations rolled in, small at first, then larger. From former residents who had moved away but still cared, and from anonymous contributors who hated the idea of corruption hiding behind community bylaws. The movement gained momentum, and with it came scrutiny. Ellen began to sense the net closing in, and in a last-ditch attempt to fortify her position, she called for a vote to limit how many properties one owner or single entity could hold, a move designed to freeze my acquisitions and protect her allies. It was a cunning counter-move. If she could pass that amendment quickly, my plan would be stalled. The timing couldn't be worse. The vote was scheduled before the audit's public release, and some members of the board she still controlled backed the motion. The next HOA meeting would decide more than bylaws. It would shape who controlled the narrative. I prepared my evidence, knowing that what I had needed to be presented at the right moment, with the right witnesses, or it would be dismissed as a vendetta. I had already lined up the accountant, the treasurer, and several homeowners whose deeds had been forged. I had a lawyer ready to challenge any procedural trick. The community gathered once more under the fluorescent lights, the tension so thick it felt like static. Ellen arrived radiant as ever, certain of victory. I took a breath, held the files to my chest like armor, and stepped forward, ready to reveal everything I had collected. The moment the first document slid across the table, the room changed. And for the first time since I moved into Maplewood, the truth began to speak louder than fear. The silence that followed after I placed the documents on the table was heavy enough to suffocate the entire room. Ellen's confident posture faltered, just slightly, as she stared at the stack of papers that bore her own signature. Around us, homeowners shifted in their chairs, their nervous glances bouncing between her and the evidence that suddenly seemed to darken the air itself. I could feel the tension pulsing through the room, years of anger, fear, and unspoken frustration rising to the surface. The HOA board members, once obedient shadows behind Ellen's authority, looked uneasy. They had stood by her out of convenience, not loyalty, and now that her empire was trembling, I could see cracks forming in their resolve. I began by summarizing what the audit had uncovered: missing funds, falsified invoices and contracts, routed through shell companies linked to Elon's cousin and her husband. I didn't raise my voice or accuse her outright. I let the evidence speak for itself. As I laid out each page, each transaction, each signature, the weight of her corruption grew undeniable. The room began to murmur. Some homeowners gasped softly as they realized their own fines had likely funded Ellen's personal empire. Others whispered angrily, connecting their experiences with the theft in front of them. Ellen tried to interject. claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the accountant, who had conducted the audit, stood up, his calm, professional tone slicing through her excuses. He confirmed that multiple financial records were deliberately altered, that payments had been made to non-existent companies, and that there was no legitimate explanation for the missing funds. Every sentence he spoke stripped another layer from Ellen's facade. Her hands clenched the edge of the podium as she tried to maintain her composure, her practiced smile twitching at the corners. I watched her struggle. The woman who had once ruled this neighborhood through intimidation, now cornered by her own deceit. When I revealed the forged deeds, the room erupted. Gasps turned to outrage as I showed proof that Ellen had illegally transferred portions of communal property to private entities she controlled. The residents demanded answers. How could she sell land that didn't belong to her? Why were there maintenance fees funding her greed? The board members looked panicked, realizing their complicity could now destroy them too. The lawyer I had brought stood and addressed the room, explaining that forgery and embezzlement within a homeowners association were criminal offenses, not administrative ones. His calm, deliberate tone carried more authority than Ellen's entire reign. For the first time, people saw not just corruption, but consequences. Ellen's voice cracked as she tried to regain control, insisting it was all fabricated, a personal vendetta orchestrated by me. But that was when the former treasurer stepped forward. The sight of him froze Ellen completely. His testimony hit harder than any document could. He described how Ellen had pressured board members to sign blank checks, how she'd arranged secret meetings where financial decisions were made behind closed doors, and how anyone who questioned her was bullied into silence or resignation. His voice trembled at first but grew steadier with each word, and when he finished, the room was silent again. Not the silence of fear, but of realization. The illusion of control had shattered. The vote Ellen had scheduled that night, meant to protect her from property consolidation, now turned against her. Homeowners demanded an emergency motion, a vote of no confidence to remove Ellen and dissolve the existing board entirely. It was unprecedented, but the bylaws allowed it. The motion was seconded before Ellen could even speak. One by one, hands went up, hesitant at first, then with conviction. The tally was clear. She had lost. The woman who had ruled over Maplewood Estates for years with an iron smile was officially stripped of power in less than an hour. But what should have felt like victory tasted bittersweet. As the meeting dispersed, I noticed Ellen lingering at the back, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked scared. I expected rage, defiance, denial, but instead, she seemed calculating, like someone already plotting their next move. Something in her eyes told me this wasn't over, and I was right. 2 days later, the local news picked up the story. Headlines read, HOA president removed amid fraud allegations. It was everything I'd worked for. Public exposure, accountability, justice. Reporters came to Maplewood, filming the perfect lawns and quiet streets that had hidden years of corruption. But not everyone celebrated. Ellen still had influence in subtle places, old friends on the planning committee, contacts in real estate circles, and perhaps even people within law enforcement. I began receiving strange calls late at night, silent at first, then filled with static and faint breathing. My mailbox was knocked over twice in 1 week. My car tires were slashed. Each act felt personal, calculated. The community was with me, but Ellen wasn't going down quietly. She filed a lawsuit claiming defamation, accusing me of falsifying evidence to take over the HOA for personal profit. It was a desperate move, but it was enough to drag me into a legal battle I hadn't anticipated. The neighbors stood by me at first, but the longer it dragged on, the more exhaustion and doubt began to creep in. Some feared that the neighborhood's reputation would collapse under the scandal, that property values would plummet. I understood their fear. I had once moved here for peace, too, but peace built on corruption wasn't peace at all. The court filings were public, and with each document, more details about Elon's activities surfaced. I could have stopped then, walked away, let the authorities handle it. But something in me couldn't. Maybe it was pride, maybe principle. But I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for the people who had been broken by her. The investigation deepened, and the police finally opened a formal case. The evidence I'd collected had grown into a mountain, too big to bury. Ellen's carefully crafted world was imploding, but as I would soon learn, desperate people don't surrender quietly. And the next time I saw Ellen Cranston, she wouldn't be standing at a podium. She'd be standing in my driveway, smiling that same hollow smile that once fooled everyone. Only this time, it wasn't a smile of power. It was a warning. The first time I saw Ellen in my driveway after her downfall, it was just past dusk. The sky had that strange bruised hue that comes after a storm, and the air felt too still, too quiet. I had just returned from work when I noticed her silver SUV parked across the street, headlights off, engine idling. My stomach tightened instantly. For months, I'd only seen her name in legal filings or news reports, never in person. But there she was, standing near my mailbox, hands clasped in front of her, wearing that same calculated smile that once fooled everyone in Maplewood. She didn't look defeated. She looked composed, like someone rehearsing control in the face of collapse. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. I simply watched from a distance as she placed an envelope inside my mailbox, turned, and walked back to her car without saying a word. The SUV drove off slowly, fading into the shadows of the cul-de-sac. I approached cautiously, heart thudding. The envelope was unmarked, plain white, sealed, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, typed sentence: "You think you've won, but you've only taken my place." No signature, but I didn't need one. The moment I read it, I felt an old chill crawl up my spine. Ellen wasn't warning me. She was predicting something. The following days felt heavy with unseen eyes. The neighborhood, though technically free of Ellen's rule, had become fractured. Without her oppressive hand, residents began arguing among themselves. People fought over budget allocations, landscaping responsibilities, and new leadership elections. The same neighbors who once united against her were now bickering in emails and meetings. Fear had turned into confusion, and confusion into resentment. It hit me then, Ellen's letter wasn't wrong. Her control had been replaced with chaos, and though I hadn't meant to, I had become the de facto center of it. People came to me with every dispute, every decision, every complaint. I tried to stay out of it, but the vacuum left by her absence pulled me in whether I liked it or not. I had spent months tearing down a system, but I had never thought about what would happen after it was gone, and in that power vacuum, her shadow still lingered. The investigation against Ellen continued in the background. Police had collected enough evidence to file charges of fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of community funds. Her husband's real estate company was being audited. It should have been the end. But Ellen was a master of manipulation, and she knew how to use sympathy like a weapon. She began telling anyone who would listen that she was a victim of harassment, that I had orchestrated everything to seize control of the neighborhood for personal gain. A few people believed her, or at least wanted to. I started noticing old allies distancing themselves, hesitant to take sides. It wasn't open betrayal, but silence, the kind that stings worse than lies. Then strange things began happening again. The security cameras I'd installed after the vandalism started to glitch, their footage cutting out during the same hours every night. My trash bins were knocked over repeatedly. A dead crow appeared on my porch one morning, its wings spread wide. I told myself it was coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Ellen was too deliberate for coincidences. I changed my locks, added more cameras, and informed the police, but there was little they could do without proof. Legally, she couldn't come near me due to the pending case, but she didn't need to. She just had to make me feel her presence. Meanwhile, the community's frustration grew. Without Ellen's iron hand, the HOA's systems had fallen apart. Fines weren't being processed, maintenance projects stalled, and the common areas began to show signs of neglect. Grass grew uneven, streetlights flickered out, and paint peeled from the clubhouse walls. The image of Maplewood, the perfect, pristine neighborhood, was fading fast. Some residents blamed me for starting all this, saying things were better when Ellen was in charge. That irony hit harder than any fine she'd ever given me. It was the kind of reversal Ellen would have savored. I knew I couldn't let her ghost win. If Maplewood was to recover, it needed order. But this time, honest order. I decided to run for interim HOA president until a proper election could be held. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about stability. I wanted to rebuild what she had broken, but without corruption. The vote was tense, divided, but I won narrowly. The irony of standing where she once stood wasn't lost on me. As I looked out over the same community center where Ellen had ruled, I promised myself I'd never become what she was. For a while, things improved. Projects restarted, transparency returned, and homeowners began to see progress. But peace is fragile in a place built on control. I started receiving anonymous tips in my HOA inbox, claims that some of Ellen's former allies were still active, sabotaging operations, delaying maintenance on purpose to make me look incompetent. It sounded paranoid, but then invoices began disappearing. Budgets were altered, and maintenance crews stopped showing up without notice. Someone was pulling strings again. Then came the phone call. A private number, late one night. A woman's voice, low and calm, said, "You're not fixing anything. You're just continuing my work." And the line went dead. My hands went cold as I listened to the dial tone. Ellen had been released on bail pending trial, and now her reach was back. Subtle, but unmistakable. The next morning, I drove past her old house, which had been foreclosed and left abandoned after the investigation. The windows were boarded, the yard overgrown, but something new caught my eye. A light flickering in the upstairs window. Faint, but steady. Someone had been inside. I pulled over and stared at it for a long time, my reflection mixing with the ghostly glow of that empty house. Maybe she was gone. Maybe she wasn't. But one thing was certain. Maplewood still belonged to her shadow. And as much as I tried to deny it, part of me feared that in fighting her corruption, I had inherited her curse. Because now, when I looked at my neighborhood, I didn't see freedom. I saw control mine, not hers. And that realization terrified me more than any letter she could ever send. The days that followed felt like living under an invisible storm. Nothing happened outright, yet everything felt off. Neighbors whispered instead of waved. Emails from the HOA board came half-finished, and even the landscapers who once smiled at me now avoided eye contact. The tension in Maplewood had become suffocating, like everyone was waiting for something to snap. I poured my energy into restoring order, determined to rebuild what Ellen had broken. But every time I made progress, something inexplicable went wrong. Budgets went missing. Work orders were deleted. And then there was the clubhouse fire. It wasn't a large blaze, just enough to scorch the back wall and destroy several filing cabinets. The ones holding archived financial records from Elon's term. The fire marshal called it an electrical fault, but I knew better. That fire wasn't random. It was deliberate, targeted, and perfectly timed. What scared me more was how neatly it erased the paper trail that could have finished Ellen for good. That night, as I stood near the charred remains of the clubhouse, the smell of burnt paper and ash mixing with damp air, I realized I wasn't dealing with just Ellen anymore. She had help, or worse, influence. The kind that lingers even when she's not around. Rumors spread quickly. Some residents claimed I had staged the fire to hide my own misuse of HOA funds. The accusations stung because they mirrored exactly what Ellen used to do, turning suspicion into control. I began receiving hate mail. "You're just like her. Ellen 2.0. Maplewood doesn't need another dictator." It was almost poetic in a sick way. I had overthrown a tyrant only to inherit her reputation. And the more I tried to fix things, the more people doubted me. Even the local news picked up the tension, spinning it into another HOA and chaos story. Cameras appeared at the neighborhood entrance, and reporters hounded me with questions about the mysterious fire and leadership turmoil. I wanted to shout that this wasn't my fault, that Ellen was orchestrating this from the shadows. But doing so would only make me sound paranoid. The line between truth and madness was blurring fast. Then came the second envelope. This time it wasn't in my mailbox, it was taped to my front door right at eye level. Inside was a photo. A grainy image from one of my own security cameras, showing me standing near the burned clubhouse the night of the fire. Someone had edited the timestamp to make it look like I'd been there before the blaze started. Beneath the photo, a single sentence was scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize. "You became what you destroyed." My blood ran cold. It wasn't Elon's handwriting, but the message was hers. Whoever sent it wanted to make me believe I had fallen into her role completely. For a moment, I even questioned myself had I gone too far. Had my obsession with control turned me into the very thing I fought against? I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered like a stain. That same week, Ellen's trial was delayed. Her lawyers filed new motions, claiming evidence tampering and community bias, both of which somehow pointed back to me. She was using the chaos to build her defense, painting me as an unstable vigilante. And the terrifying part? The narrative was believable. She didn't need to prove her innocence, just my instability. One night, unable to sleep, I drove through Maplewood's dark, silent streets. Every porch light, every mailbox, every neatly trimmed hedge reminded me of the war I'd started. I passed Ellen's old house again. The boards on the windows were gone. The for sale sign had been replaced with a new one, under new ownership. My heart sank as I saw the realtor's name. It was Ellen's husband's company. Legally, she couldn't return, but someone connected to her was reclaiming her territory piece by piece. Within a week, workers arrived to repaint the house, mow the lawn, and fix the fences. No one knew who the new buyer was, but I had a sick feeling in my gut. I sent a request to the county for property records, but the ownership was hidden under an LLC, the same tactic Ellen used when she tried to hide her financial misconduct. It was her all over again, just with a new face. Meanwhile, the residents of Maplewood were losing patience. They wanted leadership, stability, anything that felt normal again. I called for an emergency meeting, hoping to restore confidence. But the night of the meeting, only a handful showed up. Halfway through my presentation, someone stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. Maybe Ellen wasn't the problem. Maybe it's this place that makes people like her. The silence that followed was worse than any argument. They were right, in a way. Maplewood was more than a neighborhood. It was a system built on image and control. And systems like that didn't die with one person's downfall. They simply waited for someone else to step in. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind in the empty hall, staring at the dim reflection of myself in the glass door. My phone buzzed with a new message. No number, no name, just a video file. I opened it. The footage showed Ellen's old house, freshly painted, lights flickering inside. The camera zoomed in on an upstairs window, and for a split second, I saw her silhouette standing perfectly still, facing the street like she'd never left. I dropped the phone, pulse racing. Whether it was real or staged didn't matter anymore. She was back in some form, maybe not physically, but in spirit, influence, or obsession. I realized then that the battle I thought I'd won was only the first round. Ellen hadn't been defeated. She'd evolved, and Maplewood was her playground again. As I drove home that night, her final letter replayed in my mind. "You've only taken my place." I had dismissed it as a taunt before. Now, I wasn't so sure. Because deep down, a quiet voice whispered, what I didn't want to admit, maybe she was right. By the time autumn crept into Maplewood, the neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. The air carried that uneasy chill of transition, and the once pristine lawns were scattered with fallen leaves no one bothered to rake. The HOA's rules had become a joke, the meetings half empty. The once proud residents avoided each other like strangers. Even the sign at the entrance, "Welcome to Maplewood, a community that cares," had started to rust. It was a quiet decay, the kind that didn't happen overnight, but seeped into everything until you couldn't tell when it began. And at the center of it all, I felt myself unraveling. Every night I found new reasons to doubt what was real. Anonymous emails, whispered rumors, small accidents, a broken sprinkler line here, a complaint about negligence there. They all added up, like someone was choreographing a slow psychological breakdown. I had once believed Ellen's power came from her control over people, but now I understood it was deeper. She controlled perception. Even in absence, she was rewriting the story. The more I tried to defend myself, the guiltier I looked. The more I tried to lead, the more authoritarian I seemed. She had turned my integrity into my weakness. Then came the first community defection. The Thompsons, one of the oldest families in Maplewood, packed up and left overnight. Their house was sold within days to another anonymous buyer through the same LLC tied to Ellen's husband's company. Soon after, 2 more families followed. The cul-de-sac that once felt like home now felt like a stage being reset. I tried to track the pattern, and it terrified me. Every new owner was linked to the same network of properties Ellen once managed. She was repopulating the neighborhood piece by piece, rebuilding her kingdom under new names. The realization hit me like ice. I hadn't destroyed her empire. I'd given her time to rebuild it quietly. As the days grew shorter, paranoia took root. I began noticing the same black SUV parked at odd hours near my street, never close enough to identify, but always in view. I changed routes to work, adjusted my security system, even started carrying a recorder just in case something happened. Sleep became impossible. My nights were spent replaying everything: the fines, the first warning, the letter, the fire, the meetings. Somewhere along the way, my victory had turned into an obsession. An obsession was exactly how Ellen had fallen. One morning, after another sleepless night, I found a flyer taped to my door. It wasn't threatening, but it made my stomach drop. Neighborhood revival meeting hosted by Maplewood's original visionary. No name, no date, just a QR code that led to a sleek, private website. The logo at the top was identical to the old HOA crest Ellen had designed years ago. The site listed updates, plans for renewed community oversight, and an invitation to return to order. The words dripped with her language, structure, compliance, excellence. At the bottom, one line burned into my eyes: "Everything lost can be restored." That was all I needed to see. She was coming back. Not through lawsuits or intimidation this time, but through illusion. By promising the people what they missed most: peace. That night, I drove past the old clubhouse. The fire damage had been repaired. New banners hung outside, fresh paint on the walls, and lights glowing inside. A crowd had gathered. I parked a distance away and watched as familiar faces entered through the front door's neighbors. Former board members, even some who had once condemned Ellen publicly. They were returning to her willingly. The betrayal stung more than I wanted to admit. Inside, I saw a woman standing at the podium, her back to me. For a fleeting second, the way she moved, the way she gestured, it was her. The same deliberate posture, the same calculated calm, but when she turned, it wasn't Ellen. It was a new figure, a woman named Susan Clark, listed on the property documents as the new community consultant, yet behind her words, behind her gestures, I could feel Ellen's ghost. Susan was just a front Ellen's mouthpiece. The meeting ended with cheers and applause, and as people filtered out, I heard them say things like, "Finally, order again, and this place needs rules." It felt like watching the same nightmare reset. I stayed in my car for a long time afterward, the steering wheel cold beneath my hands, until I noticed something written in dust on my windshield. "It's not over." My chest tightened. I looked around, scanning every shadow, every passing car, but the street was empty. Only the clubhouse lights flickered in the distance. The next morning, I received an email from the new HOA Revival Committee announcing a restructuring vote motion to dissolve the existing board and elect a new one under fresh leadership. My name wasn't listed anywhere. I wasn't even invited. They were erasing me, the same way I had erased Ellen. Slowly, methodically, ruthlessly. And the worst part? The residents welcomed it. They were tired of the chaos. They wanted to believe in order again, even if it meant surrendering to the same system that once crushed them. As the vote approached, I realized something dark and unshakable. The neighborhood didn't just need control. It craved it. They didn't want freedom. They wanted to be told what to do, how to live, how to think. Ellen understood that from the start. That was her true power. I drove past the houses that night, each one glowing softly behind closed blinds. Each one a silent witness to everything that had happened. I thought about leaving, selling the house, disappearing. starting over somewhere new. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not while she was still out there pulling the strings from behind the curtain. I couldn't let Maplewood fall back under her rule. Not again. The line between revenge and obsession had blurred long ago, but one truth remained clear in my mind. This wasn't over. Not until one of us was gone for good. And as the wind rustled through the empty streets, whispering through fences and driveways, I realized Ellen had already won the first battle of this new war. She had made me just like her. The night before the vote felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground beneath you was already crumbling. Maplewood had gone silent again. Not peaceful silence, but the eerie kind that comes before something breaks. Even the air felt heavier, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. From my window, I could see porch lights flicker across the cul-de-sac, one by one, as if signaling allegiance. I'd spent the last few weeks watching my neighbors slip away from me, one after another, seduced by the promise of order that the new committee offered. They didn't care who ran it anymore, as long as their lawns were neat, the streets were clean, someone else carried the burden of control. And that was the cruelest truth of all. Ellen had never forced them to obey. She had simply given them permission to stop thinking. Now, they wanted that again, and I was the only one standing in the way. I sat in my office, surrounded by boxes of documents, files, and proof of everything Ellen had done. Fraudulent payments, fake invoices, the shell companies, the bank transfers, all of it. I had enough evidence to destroy her, but none of it mattered if no one cared to see it. The people of Maplewood didn't want justice anymore. They wanted comfort. As I sifted through the files one last time, my phone buzzed. A private number. Against my better judgment, I answered. No voice came through, just faint breathing, and then softly, familiar sound that froze me in place. The chime of the old HOA meeting bell. The one Ellen used to tap before calling sessions to order. It rang 3 times. Then silence. I dropped the phone. It wasn't possible. That bell had been melted in the clubhouse fire. Unless someone had kept a recording, or a replica. My heart pounded as I realized what it meant. This wasn't random harassment. It was a message. She was calling another meeting. But this time, it wasn't about control. It was about reclaiming her throne. The next day, I arrived early at the community hall, determined to face whatever came next. The parking lot was already full. People were dressed formally, like they were attending a ceremony. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. At the front, under the banner Maplewood Revival Committee, stood Susan Clark, the same woman I'd seen before. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, every word carrying the same rhythm Ellen once used when commanding obedience. Tonight, she said, we restore balance to our beloved community. Her phrasing was exact, Ellen's phrasing. I sat quietly at the back, unnoticed, watching faces light up with relief. Then Susan paused mid-speech, smiled faintly, and gestured toward the doorway. My breath caught when I saw who walked in. Ellen. She looked older, thinner, but still carried herself like a queen returning from exile. The crowd gasped, but no one spoke. She wasn't supposed to be here legally. She was barred from HOA affairs pending trial. Yet here she was, walking calmly down the aisle, every step echoing like a verdict. She reached the podium, whispered something to Susan, and took her place behind the microphone. I never left you, she began. Her voice was quiet but carried through the room. I was protecting this community the way it deserved. And now, I'm here to finish what was interrupted. The crowd erupted into applause. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was reclaiming everything, in public, confident that no one would stop her. I rose to speak, but before I could, a few men from the committee blocked my path. You're not on the agenda, one said. The same line Ellen used to use to silence dissent. I tried to push forward, holding up my files, shouting that she was under investigation, that this was illegal. But the room didn't hear me. Or maybe they didn't want to. Ellen turned her gaze toward me, calm and satisfied. We've all seen what happens without structure, she said, addressing the audience but staring straight at me. Chaos, division, fear. This isn't about me. It's about Maplewood. And tonight, we choose order. The vote passed before I could stop it. The crowd raised their hands, some eagerly, some hesitantly, but enough to make it final. Ellen was reinstated as HOA president under a new charter. The irony was brutal. The same people who once begged me to stand up to her were now cheering her return. As I stood there, stunned, a slow, mocking smile spread across her face. She didn't have to say it. I'd already lost. The meeting ended in celebration. People crowded around her, shaking her hand, thanking her for coming back. I walked outside, numb, the cold night air biting my skin. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown email address. It was a single sentence, "Now you understand." No signature. But I didn't need one. Ellen's revenge wasn't just about power. It was about proving that no matter what I did, I could never truly beat her, because she didn't just control Maplewood. She was Maplewood. As I stood there on the edge of the parking lot, watching the lights flicker inside the hall where she stood surrounded by praise, something inside me hardened. Maybe I couldn't destroy her the first time because I played fair, but now I knew better. If she wanted a war, I'd give her one. And this time, I wouldn't fight for justice or peace. I'd fight to erase her completely. Not just from Maplewood, but from every memory she ever touched. The line between us had vanished long ago. Now, there was no more Ellen versus me. There was only one of us left to finish the story. The last battle unfolded not with fireworks or a dramatic arrest, but with a slow, surgical unraveling so precise, it felt like watching a scalpel at work. I had learned from every mistake, every underestimation, and now I moved with a cold patience that matched Ellen's own, gathering not just documents, but witnesses, bank records, and digital breadcrumbs that could not be plausibly denied. I spent weeks compiling a dossier so complete, it felt obscene. A ledger of transactions, voicemail recordings, security footage rescued from corrupted drives by a forensic specialist, sworn affidavits from homeowners who had been bullied into silence, and even the handwriting expert's report proving forgery. I took that dossier to a county prosecutor who, this time, listened with the gravity this case deserved. She read every page, met with the accountant, and convened a special investigation task force, because what had started as HOA mismanagement had metastasized into organized fraud and racketeering. While the legal gears turned, I worked on the other front, the court of public opinion, but this time I refused sensationalism and hysteria. Instead, one presented facts, verified and irrefutable. And I did it not in a crowded meeting, but in a meticulously organized community forum, streamed online for transparency, so people could no longer hide. Behind plausible deniability, I invited former residents who had been driven out, the treasurer who had fled, repairmen who had been paid under false invoices, and the families whose deeds had been altered. One by one, they stepped forward. Not with the theatrical rage that had marked our earlier confrontations, but with quiet, devastating clarity. And when the accountant displayed a timeline of funds funneled to shell companies and when a bank, investigator traced transfers to an LLC registered under Elon's cousin. You could feel the room shift as reality settled on everyone like snow. Legal warrants were issued within days, not the slow, bureaucratic crawl I had feared. Subpoenas reached into the tight web of contractors and real estate firms that had enabled her, and within a week investigators arrived at Ellen's house with a list of records to seize. She was cautious, of course, but she was also human, and humans make mistakes when they believe themselves untouchable. She had left a paper trail in between her shadows, an approval here, a signed invoice there, and it was enough. The night the task force executed their search warrants, the neighborhood hummed with a terrible electricity. Reporters lined the curb, neighbors clustered in small knots with phones held up, and I watched from the edge of the crowd as evidence boxes were carried out and loaded into unmarked vans. Ellen stood on her porch under the old porch light that had once made her seem regal, and for a blinking second, something like remorse passed across her face before she hardened it into the practiced, unflinching stare she used on camera. Arrests followed not as an instant collapse but as a methodical cascade. Associates with small pockets of responsibility were charged. Bank accounts frozen, and the LLCs she used to hide transactions were put into receivership. The charges against her were far more extensive than anyone in Maplewood had imagined. They included fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and a long list of counts tying her to a pattern of exploitation that left families bankrupt and homes in the hands of faceless shell companies. In court, the theater of justice was both brutal and necessary. Her defense tried to paint a picture of a woman overwhelmed, of clerical errors and mismanagement, but evidence is a patient thing, and witnesses do not forget the sting of intimidation. Neighbors who had once been silenced found their voices again, not to gloat, but to reclaim what had been taken: security, dignity, and the right to live in their homes without someone whispering rules like threats. The verdict did not feel like vengeance. It felt like a community waking up. Ellen was convicted, and the sentence included restitution orders and forfeiture of properties and assets tied to the scheme. But the legal victory was merely the framework for something deeper I had wanted from the beginning: restoration. With the houses and funds reclaimed, a receiver converted the tangled ownership into a community land trust, giving Maplewood the kind of stability it had lacked: property held collectively, decisions made transparently, and safeguards written into the charter to prevent the concentration of power that had allowed one person to become a private sovereign. I watched the trustee meetings with the same focus I had given the audit months earlier. But this time, the meetings were different. They were noisy, imperfect, and humane, filled with neighbors who argued over paint colors and security plans and how to allocate a communal budget for tree trimming. Small things that once would have been exploited for profit, but now felt like the ordinary friction of freedom. There were costs to victory that no legal ruling could erase. Some families had already left, and their absence was a scar. Some neighbors never forgave each other for the seasons of mistrust that Ellen had sown, and I carried my own mark: sleepless nights, paranoia that never fully lifted, and an uneasy awareness that my methods had sometimes echoed the very control I despised. I chose, publicly and privately, to accept those costs. I organized community panels on governance, helped draft bylaws that required regular audits and democratic safeguards, and mentored a new generation of board members to understand that leadership meant service, not dominion. Slowly, houses that had been empty filled with new families who came because the price had dropped and because a tale of corruption had taught a lesson about oversight. The clubhouse was repainted by volunteers in a single weekend. Children's laughter returned to the green strip that had once been stolen. And the mailbox by my own gate stopped being a symbol of torment and started feeling bizarrely like an ordinary piece of life. When the dust settled, I realized something I had refused to see at the outset. The real power in a place like Maplewood is not located in any one title or name, but in the communal muscle of ordinary people deciding to care for each other instead of conceding their agency to a single ruler. Ellen's final words at sentencing, a quiet, bitter insistence that she had only held things together, echoed like a ghost I could now face without fear. Her empire had crumbled not because of spectacle, but because refusal to be governed by fear had become louder than the lie of convenience. In the end, I did not buy the whole neighborhood in the way I once imagined. I bought back its future in the currency of truth, patience, and stubborn civic labor. I sold some of the properties I had quietly acquired to first-time homeowners under the trust's terms, ensuring the community would be rejuvenated rather than reconsolidated, and used the remaining assets to create an emergency fund for families in need and an endowment to pay for independent audits forever after. The final irony was small and sharp. The man who set out to destroy a tyrant became, for a while, the axis of the very struggle he fought, but he learned to step back. I learned to listen. Maplewood never returned to its old glossy perfection, nor should it have. Its new life was messier and truer. On a spring morning sometime after the trial, I walked the green strip with neighbors who had once feared my steps. A child chased a ball past us. A dog bounded through the grass. An elderly woman smiled and called out a correction to a neighbor's pruning. Ordinary, small, human. I paused, looking at the row of houses at the clubhouse with its repaired roof. and at the sign at the entrance freshly painted. Maplewood, a community that cares. It wasn't a promise to be flawless, but it was a promise to be watched by many, not ruled by one. As for Ellen, she served her sentence, and the days of her private reign became something people told like a cautionary legend. Sometimes she wrote letters from prison, bitter and unread. And sometimes I would imagine her in the echo of the old meeting bell. But most nights I slept without checking the locks twice. And when I passed the mailbox on my way to the corner, I tipped my hat to the ordinary life that had finally returned imperfect, democratic, and alive. And I understood, finally, that the real victory was not in toppling a tyrant, but in rebuilding a place where no one could ever wear that crown again.